because this is a case of a Cinderella story gone horribly wrong. In this case, there won't be any glass slipper. There won't be any handsome prince. The defendant doesn't have to be home by midnight. And there won't be any happy ending. Because this is a case where you only have the evil stepmother. And as a result of that, an 11-year-old child was starved to death at her hand, while her own children remained healthy and happy. Now, the judge has read you the indictment, and I'm not going to bother to read it again to you, except to remind you that this really, the indictment are the formalized charges. And this is a terrible case. The facts of this case are difficult. There are going to be photographs, and there's going to be testimony that it's hard not to look away. But you just took an oath to reach a verdict that speaks the truth. And in order to reach the truth of this case, you can't flinch. You can't turn away from the truth. When the police arrived, they discovered Amon Moss, the husband of this defendant. You'll hear from Amon Moss. You'll hear that he's already taken responsibility for his part in this case, and that he's currently serving a life sentence in prison. But what they learned immediately from Amon Moss was that there was a trash can across the parking lot sitting in the grass of the apartment complex that they lived in. And when the officers went to the trash can and they opened the trash can, the words of the officer were, "I saw the burned body of a little person." What was later discovered at autopsy is that it was the body of Amani Moss. She was 11 years old. She weighed 32 pounds. She had been wrapped in a comforter and then put in a trash bag and stuffed head down into a galvanized trash can and set on fire. And that's where this case began its investigation. But Amani's misery really started a long time ago, much longer, 3 years before that date in November. Because at that time, Amon was at work. There were 2 other children. There was Tristan and Emma. And in 2010, they were little. They were babies. So this defendant stayed at home and took care of the babies and watched Amani and was responsible for the discipline of Amani. And in 2010, in March, she beat the lights out of that child. She used a belt. She used the buckle end of the belt. And the next day, when Amani went to school, the teachers noticed that there were bruises all over. And they reported it because they're required to. And it's the right thing to do. They reported it. And there was a police investigation. And this defendant was eventually charged with cruelty to a child in the first degree and pled guilty to that charge and was sentenced. And that changed the entire dynamic of this family. Because you'll learn that this defendant has a background in early childhood education. That for a while she worked as a teacher in a pre-K. But with that conviction, she couldn't do it anymore. She couldn't have her job. She couldn't have what she was trained to do. And she was at home with 2 little babies and a 10-year-old girl that wasn't hers. Amani was only 6 at that time, so she was at home with a 6-year-old who wasn't hers. Over the next few months and few years, Amani tried to run away. In June of 2012, Gwinnett County Police responded to an apartment where Imani and Tristan and Emma and Iman and the defendant lived all together. And she had gone up to the apartment office manager and said, I want to run away from home. I don't want to go home. That the defendant tied me up with belts and put me in a cold shower. The police responded. They didn't observe any injuries on the child. They went back. The defendant said the child wasn't telling the truth. And what they did is they returned her to her stepmother and her father because there was no evidence to charge anybody at this time, even though the defendant at that time was on probation for child cruelty. A report was made to the Department of Family and Children's Services and was investigated by the Department of Family and Children's Services. But Imani remained in the custody of her father and her stepmother. In July, this defendant called the police in the evening of July the 26th and reported that Imani had run away again. The officers responded, and in the early morning hours of the 27th, they found her asleep in the bushes up by the gate of the apartment. And when they asked her why she was there, she said she didn't want to go home. The defendant was mean to her, and she wanted to run away. But again, there was no evidence. There was no evidence of abuse. There was no evidence of injury. And Imani was returned to her father and her stepmother. You'll hear testimony from neighbors in the apartment complex that said they knew this couple had 2 children, but they never saw the third. Were never aware that that child would even exist. They saw instances where Aman and the defendant and Tristan and Emma would go out. They said, we never saw the third child. And that's what began a period of isolation and that it's hard to even find a word to describe it. Because imagine what her life must have been like. There were 2 little ones. They weren't in school. By this time, Aman was working 2 jobs to try and keep afloat. He worked from early in the morning till 2 or 3 in the afternoon. And then he would come home for a short period of time, and then he would leave to go to work again at 6 at night, 6 in the evening, and work till 10:30 or 11 at night. He had to drive an hour or 45 minutes to each job. So essentially, he was sleeping and eating at his house, but was at work the rest of the time because that's how the bills had to be paid. So the defendant is there with a stepdaughter she hates, 2 children of her own. And in the fateful week of Halloween of 2013, right before the body was discovered, we're going to show you a series of events. Halloween was on a Thursday, but according to the statement of Aman, it really began on October the 24th. On the 24th, he came home from work and found Imani unresponsive in a bathtub. She couldn't speak. Her eyes rolled back and forth, but she couldn't communicate. And Aman picked her up and put her into bed, and she never left that bed. Because either on the 28th, or more likely the 30th, she died. The defendant was home when she died, and in fact may have called Aman at work and said, Imani's passed. But certainly, when Aman came home from his first job, on the 30th, he discovered Imani dead. The defendant was in the room when he discovered her dead and said, we have to hide the body. I can't go to jail. I don't want to lose my other children. So Aman went to work for his second job. And after that job, he went to Walmart and he bought a trash can. You'll see that trash can. We'll bring it to you to look at, but it's a galvanized trash can. And we know at that point, from his own statement, that he took Imani out of her bed, a bed that we'll show was soiled with human waste. And they flipped the mattress. And the next day, this defendant went to Anna's Linens and bought a new coverall and new sheets. And she put the new cover, they flipped the mattress, stripped the bed, put the new cover on it. And the whole plan was, we're going to get rid of the body. We have to get rid of the body. Those are the words of the defendant. And we'll report her as a runaway. Halloween came, and Tristan and Emma were dressed up for trick-or-treat. We'll show you pictures of that. But keep in mind, during the time that those pictures were taken, and those two smiling children were in their costumes, Imani's laying dead because her body had been moved into a computer room that was part of the apartment. While Tiffany was texting with her sister about bags of candy, Imani was laying in the computer room dead. On the 31st, sometime on the 31st, they decided they had to move the body and they were going to take it out and burn it. This defendant urged Iman to do that. Iman, by this time, was starting to say, this is messed up. That's not the words he used. The words he used are obscene. But he said, this is messed up. We need to call the police. The defendant continued to insist, we can't call the police. I can't go to prison. I'm on probation. We have to get rid of the body. So they took her out of the computer room. By that time, rigor mortis had set in. Her body was stiff. Her limbs were stiff. But they bent her, and they broke her, and they managed to get her about this big and duct taped her into this position. And then Iman said that he couldn't put her in a trash can that way, and he covered her with a comforter. And they stuffed it all in a trash bag and carried it down from the apartment and put Imani in the trash can in the truck, in their truck, which was a Trailblazer. That night, early in the morning of November the 1st of 2013, they decided to take the two small children with them and go and burn the body. At first, this defendant was suggesting that they burn the body and get rid of it in Bethesda Park, which was near where they lived. But that didn't work. So they drove around with Imani's body in a trash can in the back of a Trailblazer. And eventually they went up Satellite Boulevard, and Iman noticed a place that he could pull off the road. They both took the trash can out of the truck. We'll prove that to you by the fingerprints of this defendant on the trash can. They poured charcoal briquettes into the bottom of the trash bag. They doused her with lighter fluid, and they set her on fire. And both of them stood there and watched her burn. Iman realized she wasn't going to burn. She wasn't going to burn down to ash. So the fire was put out, and the body was loaded back into the truck. And this defendant, her two children, and Iman drove back to the apartment. The next day, Iman drove the truck to work with the body in the back of the truck. He worked a regular shift, but when he came home, he couldn't take it anymore. He called one of his friends, who urged him to call the police. He thought about it. He went to work his second job. But when he got home, he couldn't take it anymore. He told this defendant, I'm calling the police. I can't do this. This is screwed up. And what did this defendant do? She took her 2 children, she jumped in the Trailblazer, and she split. And that's how the police got that 3 o'clock in the morning call on November the 2nd.
We're returning to 18B 1541-1, State of Georgia versus Tiffany Nicole Moss, the defendant's present, along with standby counsel, state's counsel's present as well. I am informed we have a verdict, and I'll be bringing the jury in here momentarily. Just a note to our various observers, I have no idea what it is that the verdict might be. You might be happy with it, you might be unhappy with it. But whatever your reaction to the verdict is, don't react out where the jury can see it. Keep your feelings about the verdict to yourself. If you don't believe that you'll be able to do that, please step outside at this point in time. Please bring our jury.
Yes, Your Honor, we do.
Is it unanimous?
Yes, Your Honor.
Has it been signed by your foreperson?
It has.
Please give it to the bailiff. This is the jury's verdict in case 18B 1541-1. This is the State of Georgia versus Tiffany Nicole Moss. Verdict, count 1, murder. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder. Count 2, felony murder. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of felony murder. Count 3, felony murder. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of felony murder. Count 4, cruelty to children in the first degree. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of cruelty to children first degree. Count 5, cruelty to children first degree. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of cruelty to children first degree. Count 6, concealing the death of another. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of concealing the death of another. Signed and dated by the foreperson. Please give it to counsel and the defendant for their review as to form. You can be seated. Thank you very much. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I'm informed you have a verdict. Is that correct?
Correct.
Is it unanimous?
Yes, it is, Your Honor.
Has it been signed by your foreperson?
It has.
Please give it to the bailiff. This is the jury's verdict in case 18B 1541-1, State of Georgia versus Tiffany Nicole Moss. Count 1, findings of jury as to alleged statutory aggravating circumstances. We, the jury, find beyond a reasonable doubt that the offense of murder as alleged in count 1 was outrageously or wantonly vile, horrible, or inhuman in that it involved torture of the victim before death. We, the jury, find beyond a reasonable doubt that the offense of murder as alleged in count 1 was outrageously or wantonly vile, horrible, or inhuman in that it involved depravity of mind of the defendant. Signed and dated by the foreperson. Verdict as to penalty, count 1, murder. We, the jury, recommend and fix the penalty as death. Signed and dated by the foreperson. Please give it to counsel for their review as to form, sir. Any exceptions to the form of the verdict by the state?
None from the state as to form or something.
Any exceptions to the form of the verdict by the defense?
No, Your Honor.
Ladies and gentlemen, under these circumstances, it's necessary that the court conduct a poll of the jury. It simply means that I have a series of questions to ask you each individually. We'll begin with juror